Welcome to module number 5, where we will talk about racism, biological variation, and environmental adaptation in modern human populations. So let's get started. It is tempting to take what we have learned from the last chapter and conclude that different human populations have been isolated for a long period of time and have developed a unique set of adaptations to survive in their particular environments. It is also tempting, perhaps, to simplify matters by grouping these people into categories and calling these categories races. In fact, people have been classifying themselves and others into different races for a long time. As you will see in this module, races are in fact biologically meaningless categories that do little to explain the variation we see in people today. We'll examine this question of race. In addition, we'll look at how humans adapt through their lifetime, a subject termed human growth and development. Additionally, we'll take a trip around the world and look at how different humans have adapted biologically to their environments. Humans are remarkably adaptable, living in extreme temperatures and altitudes. In this module, we'll examine how humans are able to do this biologically. First, let's deconstruct the concept of race. For a long time, it was thought that all humans could be categorized into different racial categories. When early European explorers, such as Christopher Columbus, discovered peoples of different lands, they emphasized the physical differences rather than the similarities. Even anthropologists engaged in this activity seek to find the biological and skeletal patterns that distinguish the different races of humans. At the right of this slide is one such image from the 18th century German anatomist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who studied human skulls and categorized them into 5 races: Mongoloids, Malays, Ethiopians or Africans, American Indians, and Caucasoids. And we see that only 4 are illustrated here. So critical to this way of thinking was the idea that these races were fixed, but these ideas were flat out wrong. The great anthropologist Franz Boas tested the idea that skulls were static by studying the skull shapes of American immigrants, like those shown to the right, whose parents were born in Europe. He found that skull shape could vary. It was not fixed, as would be predicted by typological classification schemes predicted by Blumenbach. In the 1970s, the geneticist R.C. Lewontin moved beyond skull shapes to DNA. He surmised that if races were real groupings with biological foundations, then blood types, serum proteins, and enzyme variants should all cluster according to racial categories. Given these data, how should we think about human diversity? One way that does seem to be biologically meaningful is the idea of a cline, or a gradual change in a phenotypic character from one population to the next. Blood types seem to follow this pattern, as does skin coloration. Interestingly enough, not all phenotypes follow the same patterns, meaning that racial categories can only work if just a few phenotypes are considered, like skin coloration, for instance. But by doing this, one ignores the other phenotypes that do not cluster in the same way. We'll return to variation in skin coloration later in this module. The last few chapters may lead one to think that a living organism is built quite mechanically from the DNA blueprint, but it does not work out quite this way. Instead, DNA is like a recipe. And like a recipe, many external factors, like the oven temperature for instance, or the erroneous addition of an ingredient not in the recipe, can alter the final outcome. So how does the human organism achieve its final outcome? Through stages of growth and development that, while underlain by genetic control, are highly influenced by the environment. This is called the life history of an individual. The life history of a human which is essentially the timing of all the major developmental events in life, can be broken down into the stages listed on this slide. First, fertilization occurs as shown in the image in the upper right. You started out as a single egg fertilized by a single sperm. Following this event is the prenatal stage, which consists of the 40 weeks of gestation, often divided up into 3 trimesters of pregnancy. The postnatal stage consists of all of the stages that happen when you are a kid. There is a first month after birth called the neonatal stage. Then comes infancy, which starts at 2 months until the child stops breastfeeding. This happens in human hunter-gatherer populations at around the age of 2.5 or 3. Childhood follows and ends around the age of 7, when the juvenile period begins and lasts until puberty. The post-puberty but pre-adult stage is called adolescence. These are the teen years. Adulthood consists of the period from about 20 years old until death. This can be broken into 2 stages, a reproductive period and a period of senescence, which follows the childbearing years. Stressors in uterine environment can affect adult health. The first trimester is a particularly sensitive time for the developing embryo. The fertilized egg goes from 1 cell to millions, and the different organ systems begin to develop. Stressors in the intrauterine environment, such as drugs or poor nutrition, can permanently and adversely affect development at this time. In fact, these stressors have been shown to increase the likelihood of a premature birth or a stillborn infant. The second and third trimesters are primarily about growth and organ maturation. However, malnourished babies who are born with a very low birth weight for their gestational age are at a greater risk for high blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and coronary heart disease as adults. It is thought that the uterine environment can alter gene expression, called epigenetics, and can predispose an individual for diseases that happen much later in life. This is called the fetal origins hypothesis and was first proposed by Dr. David Barker, a British cardiovascular physician and professor. His data shows that small babies tend to have a higher risk of coronary heart disease later in life than large, presumably better nourished babies. Obviously, the prenatal stage of life matters quite a bit, but plenty of important events that shape the biology of an individual occur during the postnatal stage as well. Each of the postnatal periods, neonatal, infancy, childhood, juvenile, adolescent, show a different growth velocity. Growth velocity starts quite high at birth and continues at a high but decreasing rate until about the age of 2. At that point, growth levels off to 4 to 6 centimeters a year until puberty hits. At puberty, the growth velocity accelerates again, the so-called growth spurt. During adolescence, growth continues, albeit at a decreased pace, until adulthood is reached and growth velocity stops. Not only does growth change from period to period, but other anatomical changes occur as well. For instance, during infancy, the deciduous or baby teeth erupt, as is shown in the lower right image. This happens at a predictable rate until weaning time, when the infant no longer relies on his or her mother's breast milk, and all 20 deciduous teeth have erupted. During infancy, both motor skills and cognitive skills are acquired rapidly, so that by the time the childhood begins, a 3-year-old can walk and talk. Throughout infancy, the brain grows at a very fast pace, as can be seen in the top graph. This growth puts a very large energetic burden on the mother, who supplies the energy for brain growth in her infant with milk through lactation. Even after weaning, the steady and energetically expensive growth of brain tissue continues into childhood. It is no accident that during childhood, as the brain is growing and maturing, important skills are learned. By the age of 6, the brain is fully grown in volume. which is why children have very large heads for their body size, as seen in the image at the bottom right. Brain maturation continues well past adolescence and into. Also starting around the age of 6, permanent teeth begin to erupt, as can be seen in the dental x-ray at the bottom left, and these replace the deciduous teeth. Look again at the upper graph. Notice that in the early teen years, brain and tooth growth have ceased, but body and reproductive growth begin to pick up the pace. This is the onset of puberty, which causes breast development and menstruation in girls and deepening of the voice, among other changes in boys. There are also developmental changes to the reproductive organs and genitals. The growth spurt that occurs at the time is, among primates, unique to humans. Growth can occur because the bone themselves are growing. This happens at the growth plates, the regions of cartilage separating the ends of the bones, called the epiphyses, and the bone shafts, or the diaphyses. So let's look for the growth plate. It appears as a distinctive white band in the MRI to the left, and as a crack in the dry bones to the right. Once the cartilage in the growth plates stop dividing, the epiphysis fuses to the diaphysis, the growth plate vanishes and growth stops. This happens typically around the start of what is called adulthood. To a large extent, genes control how long growth continues and how tall an individual can become. However, the environment also has a strong influence on long bone growth. In some populations, poor nutrition can stunt growth by limiting the growth of the cartilage and by prematurely fusing the epiphysis to the diaphysis. Examine the graph at the top of the slide as an example. These are data showing the average height of American-born males of European descent from 1710 to 1970. Notice that around 1830, heights began to plummet. Is this because shorter individuals survive better or reproduced more often? Probably not. Instead, the urbanization of America, the crowded cities, the poor nutrition, and the spread of disease led to the attenuated growth seen in this graph. However, as environmental and nutritional conditions improved, the average height increased quite dramatically. This is what is called a secular trend. Many factors have contributed to this particular secular trend: improved nutrition and the elimination of many diseases, the most notable. But this secular trend has not happened everywhere. The bottom graph shows the growth curves of kids in the Amazon River Basin in Brazil. Here, nutrition remains suboptimal, and it has resulted in a lower slope to the growth curve, and ultimately to individuals shorter than 95% of American-born children. Before we summarize, let's look at the final stage of life, adulthood. Growth and development have ceased for the most part, though the body's tissues continue to be replaced through basic maintenance. But over time, the body begins to break down, and it is not as good at keeping itself in homeostasis, which is internal equilibrium. Biological aging, also called senescence, begins to occur. For example, the body's ability to regulate bone mass begins to break down, and there can be a net loss of bone. Bone can become porous and more susceptible to breaks. This is known as osteoporosis. Notice in the graph at the top left that women suffer more osteoporosis more than men, in part because of the important role that estrogen plays in bone growth. The decrease in estrogen later in a woman's life can result in a loss of bone, shown as the gray areas in the top right X-ray of a female. Another aspect of female senescence related to the drop in estrogen levels is menopause, which occurs when a woman, usually in her 50s, stops producing eggs and stops menstruating. Menopause signals the end of a woman's reproductive life. Men can continue to produce sperm into their later years, although the sperm lose mobility as men age. There is an important evolutionary question to ask here. If women stop reproducing in their 50s, why do they continue to live another 20, 30, sometimes 40 years? The answer may be something called the grandmother effect. This post-menopausal period has been selected for in humans. Grandmothers, like the one shown at the bottom, can help out new mothers and can assist with the raising of grandchildren, thus increasing their own fitness indirectly. Certainly, their vast knowledge and a means to communicate it through language may have been the impetus for selection favoring longevity in ancestral humans. This is a summary slide of the table that appears in your book. You should review it to make sure that you understand all of the different stages of human life history and the important events that characterize each stage. Few of these events will be completely foreign to you. You are, after all, a human and have experienced many of these stages. The trick now is to assign some labels to these stages and to understand how these stages help us understand our biology, our evolutionary history, and how we adapt to changes in our environment. Adaptation is the subject of the rest of the chapter. All living organisms can adjust to new conditions and challenges, but perhaps no living organism can do this better than humans. These responses within an environmental context are called adaptation and can happen at 4 different levels. The first is genetic and the basis of natural selection. Genetic adaptations are not reversible. They happen because natural selection has favored the phenotypic products of. But adaptation is not all genetic. The adaptations that occur during the growth and development of a child are called developmental or ontogenetic. For instance, children living at high altitudes develop a larger chest girth and larger lung capacity than if they had been raised at low altitude. The genetic adaptation would simply be the capacity to change chest size depending on the environment, but the actual adaptation, such as increased lung volume, happens developmentally. Acclimatization or physiological adaptation also occurs at the level of the individual, but can happen at any time in an individual's life. A tan, for instance, is a physiological adaptation to increased sun exposure. Finally, the use of material culture to adapt to our environment is particularly prominent in humans. For instance, our ability to make and wear clothing is a cultural adaptation that allows us to stay warm in climates not otherwise inhabitable by a primate. The middle 2 types of adaptations, developmental and acclimatization, which occur over an individual's lifetime, have been termed functional. All of these adaptations can help an individual maintain normal functioning of its body, thereby increasing survival and reproductive opportunities. In other words, these adaptations all increase an individual's fitness. Humans are primates, and primates live along a narrow strip of mostly forested land in the tropics of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. However, humans have expanded their territory and now live in extreme environments, from the Sahara Desert to the Arctic Circle. We've been able to do this because of all 4 of the adaptations discussed in the previous slide: genetic, developmental, acclimatization, and cultural innovation. Still, extreme heat and extreme cold can certainly kill a person. So how does a human body deal with heat stress? One physiological response is vasodilation, in which the blood vessels on the extremity of the body enlarge. This permits more blood and therefore more heat to move to the perimeter of the body, where it can dissipate into the surrounding air, thus decreasing the core body temperature of the person. This process is enhanced by sweating, in which heat is removed from the body through evaporation of water on the skin's surface. The sweating does not reduce body temperature nearly as effectively in areas covered with hair. Thus, the hairless body, rather unique to humans, may have evolved to help keep the body cool in hot environments. In addition to these physiological responses, there are genetic adaptations to heat. Human populations living in hot environments tend to have two adaptations related to body shape. First, heat-adapted individuals tend to be quite thin, whereas cold-adapted individuals tend to be wider, a body shape that helps retain body heat. This is known as Bergmann's rule and is graphically illustrated at the bottom of the slide. Additionally, Allen's rule describes the observation that heat-adapted individuals tend to have longer limbs, which increase the surface area over which heat can be lost. Cold-adapted individuals therefore have shorter limbs and a stockier build. These body shapes appear to be genetic adaptations, helping populations adapt to their local climates by means of natural selection. Extreme cold is as challenging to the human body as extreme heat. The body needs to maintain an internal body temperature of around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. In cold environments, we can easily lose body heat through our extremities, leading to hypothermia or low body temperature. If the drop in body temperature is severe enough, a person can suffer permanent injury or even die. Adaptations to cold include cultural innovations, in which traditional societies living in cold environments wear certain clothing or build shelters to protect them from the cold, like the shelter shown here in this old photo from Siberia. Physiologically, the body can adapt by narrowing the blood vessels, a process called vasoconstriction, which reduces the flow of blood away from the body's core. Shivering is a physiological mechanism for increasing internal body temperature by generating heat through rapid muscle contraction. After just a few days in cold temperatures, the body acclimates and does not shiver as much, even if the temperature remains low. Internal body temperature can also be elevated by raising the basal metabolic rate, BMR, or the rate at which fuel in the form of food is metabolized or burned. Populations with a higher BMR tend to live in cold environments. Following Bergmann's and Allen's rules, humans living in Arctic conditions tend to have large, wide bodies and short limbs to reduce the surface area over which heat loss can occur. Humans display remarkable variation in skin coloration. Unfortunately, this human polymorphism has been used in racist thinking for centuries. Why do humans have different skin colors, and how does this occur? Certainly, skin coloration is a flexible characteristic that can change over the course of an individual's life, or even from one season to the next. Look at the image on the slide. Your skin is quite complex. It is composed of a layer of cells called the epidermis and a deeper level called the dermis. At the epidermis-dermis junction are cells called melanocysts, which produce a pigment called melanin. Those with higher melanin production have darker skin. Exposure to the sun can lead to the melanocytes to produce more granules of melanin. This is called a tan. It is clear, therefore, that the concentration of melanin and melanocytes making the skin darker is a protective agent against the sun. It is also clear that human skin coloration varies according to the intensity of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Dark, pigmented individuals tend to live close to the equator, while the lightest skinned individuals live in the higher latitudes, where the UV rays from the sun are considerably less intense. But why? The anthropologists Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin have developed an elegant explanation for the evolution of skin coloration. Solar radiation is not entirely a bad thing. It is absolutely necessary for the proper development of vitamin D, which helps regulate calcium absorption and is critical for proper skeletal development. Without proper vitamin D synthesis, the bones do not develop normally, and a condition called rickets can occur. This is shown in the image at the bottom of the slide, in these two unfortunate individuals who did not have enough exposure to sunlight to synthesize enough vitamin D to mineralize their bones. In high latitude areas, those individuals with dark skin would be blocking what little UV radiation there is and would not produce enough vitamin D to grow a functional skeleton. These individuals will not survive as well as the lighter skinned individuals. So why doesn't everyone have a light skin? The answer lies in another chemical necessary for human development: folic acid. While UV radiation is necessary for vitamin D production, it can destroy folate, or folic acid, which has been shown to be absolutely critical to proper synthesis and repair of DNA. Additionally, those with folate deficiencies are at a greater risk of having children with neural tube defects like spina bifida. Light-skinned individuals living in areas with intensive UV radiation will make plenty of vitamin D, but they are more likely to have developed folic acid stores and are at greater risk of having children with severe birth defects. As you can see, there's a tug-of-war going on here between vitamin D, which needs sunlight, and folic acid, which needs protection from sunlight. The balance reached by natural selection is the gradient of skin coloration we see in humans across the planet. Dark-skinned individuals near the equator get enough rays to produce ample vitamin D while protecting their folic acid with high concentrations of melanin. Light-skinned individuals far from the equator are not exposed to UV radiation intense enough to threaten their folic acid and have light skin so that vitamin D can be produced. These are the extremes, and every possible shade between the lightest light and the darkest dark can be found on our planet, corresponding to the intensity of UV exposure from the sun. Of course, with global travel, we now have humans of all different skin colors living in all different places. Our foods are fortified with vitamin D, and pregnant women can take folic acid supplements. Our culture has allowed us to adapt to our new standing as a species that can migrate from one side of the planet to the other in hours instead of millennia. Humans living at high altitudes have yet another challenge: lack of oxygen. An insufficient amount of oxygen is called hypoxia, and humans can easily get altitude sickness if they are not acclimated to such conditions. High altitude environments also tend to be quite dry and cold, with poor food quality. Some of these areas are shown on this map in red. They include the Andes Mountains chain along the west coast of South America, and the populations living in the Himalayas in Asia. People who travel to high altitudes can acclimate as their body adapts by producing more oxygen-carrying red blood cells. But long-term developmental and even genetic adaptations can be found in mountain populations. Children who grow and develop in mountainous regions grow larger lungs than they would have had they grown up in an area closer to sea level. Populations in the Peruvian Andes have wide chests because of their increased lung volume. They also tend to be quite small, in part because of the poor nutrition in some of these regions. Women in the Tibetan highlands, shown in the bottom image, have far more surviving children if they carry an allele for a better oxygen-binding hemoglobin molecule. Research on this aspect of Tibetan biology demonstrates that high-altitude populations adapt not only developmentally, but genetically through natural selection. It is useful now to review how humans adapt to heat, cold, varying levels of UV radiation, and high altitude. The second column categorizes the example as one of the following: a quick physiological response to the initial exposure, a longer-term functional adaptation either developmentally or physiologically, or a true genetic adaptation through natural selection. Read through this chart on your own and make sure you understand how each of these examples helps us understand the adaptability of humans. Of course, humans are not subject only to the external pressures of heat, cold, altitude, and UV radiation. We are also, as the saying goes, what we eat. Humans are remarkably diverse in terms of the kinds and amount of foods we eat, and our bodies adapt to food via the same mechanisms already described for climatic adaptation. In some places, as shown in the upper right image, scorpions are a delicacy. This may sound repulsive to some, but is it much different from a New Englander enjoying another multi-legged clawed creature, namely a lobster? In fact, diet is one of the best ways in which to understand the complex relationship between our biology and our culture. Ultimately, food is fuel, the energy we require to run our bodies, to survive, and to reproduce. The minimum amount of energy we require to survive is best called the basal metabolic requirement. But just surviving isn't enough. We need additional energy to grow and reproduce, work and exercise. The total amount of energy we require, given our activity level, is the total daily energy expenditure. Diet is a complex matter, and we require many macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, in addition to micronutrients, such as vitamins and minerals. All of the different macro and micronutrients that humans are recommended to ingest in a day can be found in your book, and you should have a look at this exhaustive list. But this raises an interesting question. What if we do not ingest all that is recommended? Sadly, many humans today are malnourished, consuming fewer than 2,000 calories per day. Efforts to combat global malnutrition have focused on calories, with efforts made to get grains like rice and corn to these populations. Although this has certainly helped the global starvation epidemic, a lack of calories is only one form of malnutrition. The lack of essential micronutrients is the other. The immune systems of undernourished populations are compromised by a lack of proper nutrition. In addition, many of these individuals live in poor environments that are rife with infectious diseases. As one might expect, malnourishment also takes its toll on growth. It could be argued that shortness is a genetic adaptation to poor nutrition, with smaller individuals surviving because they require less food. However, the data indicate that growth, while undoubtedly having a genetic component, is strongly influenced by nutrition. As shown in the chart on the far right, the height of children living in Germany dropped during the years of the two world wars, when food was not as abundant, only to catch up again after the wars ended. This is a flip side of the nutrition coin, overnutrition. By taking in more calories and exercising less, humans are now facing an obesity epidemic. As much as 50% of the adults in the US are considered overweight, as reflected in a BMI above 25 shown in the graph. 20% of children are obese, which is a BMI over 30. Why this is happening is complex, but it appears to boil down to the availability of inexpensive, high-calorie, high-fat food with fewer and fewer micronutrients. One byproduct of overnutrition is hypercholesterolemia, or high cholesterol, which is a severe risk factor of heart disease. It is a mistake to think that our ancestors did not eat meat as we do today. There is ample evidence that they did. However, we now eat meat in addition to vegetable fats and oils that have a very high fat content compared to non-domesticated animals and plants hunted and gathered by our ancestors. One additional problem associated with overnutrition is a spike in type 2 diabetes cases, 100 million worldwide. The high-fat, high-sugar diets we consume cause our pancreas to secrete an abnormal amount of insulin. Our tissues, like muscle and the liver, eventually become non-responsive to this insulin, and these tissues cannot store and access the glucose they need to function properly. The excess glucose is stored as fat, or it remains in the blood, where it raises its viscosity. In other words, it thickens it. This taxes the blood vessels and the organs like the kidneys. the high frequency of type 2 diabetes in some populations can be attributed to nutritional stress in the womb, leading gestating fetuses to be programmed into thinking they are being born into a world of famine, when instead they are born into a world of plenty. Overnutrition results in obesity is just not a challenge faced by Americans. As this graph shows, obesity is on the rise in Brazil, China, India, Mauritius, Russia, and Nauru, an island nation in the South Pacific. Why is this happening? Researchers suspect that because humans were hunter-gatherers for 99% of our existence, we evolved physiological traits that are effective at storing energy during food shortages. When times were good, humans ate and stored as fat what they did not immediately need. During famines, these fat reserves were metabolized. In many cultures today, however, the risk of famine is low. Activity levels are on the decline, and there is excessive food in the chain restaurants around every corner. Take, for example, in the growth of McDonald's around the world, including in the case of the figure in the slide of India. With these and other factors, such as fat-promoting chemicals found in plastics and canned foods, becoming global trends, the obesity epidemic remains one of the major health challenges of the 21st century. Let's look at one more adaptation, the ability of our bodies to change their size and shape to adapt to the forces we exert on them. This is called skeletal adaptation. Bones are critically important because they are the anchors of our muscles, which use the bones as leverage to move the body. But bones must be strong enough to withstand high forces. A broken bone in the wrong place at the wrong time could be fatal. Bones are under genetic control, but they are also responsive to external forces. Cells called osteoblasts can produce more bone to increase the strength of the bone. Cells called osteoclasts resorb or break down and assimilate the components of bone that is not being used. The principle that bone changes in response to external forces is called Wolff's Law. Repetitive action can stimulate these osteoblasts to make more and more bone. For instance, athletes, such as tennis players, have a thicker upper arm bone, or the humerus, in the dominant compared to the non-dominant arm. Lack of physical activity reduces an imbalance in which the osteoclasts are more active than the osteoblasts, and bone density is reduced. Inactive children tend to have smaller, less developed bones than more physically active ones. Inactive children have bones that are far less dense and are therefore susceptible to osteoporosis and fractures later in life.